I'd always imagined my final move would be one filled with peace, purpose, and enough space to breathe. After 26 years serving in the Army through 3 deployments, dozens of temporary duty stations, and one particularly long winter stationed in Alaska, I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing could have prepared me for what lay ahead with a homeowners association. Not war, not politics, not even survival training. The property was a dream. A 3-acre ranch-style home tucked right along the outer boundary of a suburban HOA development. The house was technically part of the association, but its location offered more freedom than most. Behind the property ran a narrow stretch of service road that connected to an old utility access path, a path that, according to county maps and local fire codes, qualified as a legal emergency egress point. It wasn't much to look at: gravel, overgrown weeds, and a rusted-out city sign half swallowed by bushes. But it was there, and it mattered. See, I don't just believe in exits, I live by them. In the field, I learned the hard way that every door is a potential lifeline. I've walked out of bunkers under shell fire and crawled through collapsed barracks after blasts. You never block an exit. You never assume one door is enough. So when I closed on the house and saw that neglected little path marked as a fire lane on the deed, I made a mental note. I even spent my first weekend pressure washing the old gate and replacing the rusted padlock with a heavy-duty chain system I could access from both sides. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. At the time, the HOA president was a man named Russell, retired CPA. Quiet guy. At the new resident orientation, he told me that while the HOA had some issues with inconsistent aesthetics, things were generally calm. I asked him point blank if there were any disputes about the rear exit. He shrugged and said, "It's city property technically. Not our problem." That was good enough for me. The following months passed like a page out of a retired soldier's journal. I planted tomatoes. I reinforced the old shed into a workshop. I built a proper chicken coop, predator-proof and well within county code. The neighbors mostly kept to themselves, aside from the occasional nod over a fence or a wave from across the mailbox clusters. Then one morning in late March, Russell was gone. No notice, no goodbye email, just a quick blurb in the HOA newsletter: Russell Feldman has stepped down due to health concerns. Our new interim president, Karen Willoughby, will serve until formal elections in July. I didn't think much of it. New leadership happens. But 3 days later, I got my first notice. It was taped to my front door in a bright yellow envelope: notice of violation, printed in bold letters with a fine of $50 for unapproved gate structure visible from HOA common area. The description made it sound like I had built a drawbridge out of trash: rusting iron fixtures and unsightly access gate not approved by HOA board. Violates Article 7, Section 3 of Aesthetic Continuity. I called the number listed, expecting a misunderstanding. Karen herself answered. Her voice was sharp and controlled the kind of tone you associate with middle school principals and neighborhood watch captains. She asked for my lot number, then repeated the violation as if reading a script. I explained calmly that the gate predated my ownership, that it was city approved as an emergency exit, and that I had the documentation to prove it. There was a pause. Then she said, "I'm afraid those city documents have no bearing on HOA guidelines. Your modifications are not in compliance. Further violations will incur additional fines." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice, but I knew. This wasn't about a gate. It was about control. The following week, I received another notice, this time citing non-harmonious materials used in the rear section of the fence. 2 days after that, I saw Karen walking with another board member along the trail behind my property, pointing and writing on a clipboard. I asked one of the older neighbors, Ruth, what the deal was. She whispered like she was passing military intel. "She's got her eye on you. She hates that gate. Says it makes the whole trail look like a prison camp." I stared down the trail that led to my so-called prison gate, the one city fire code had specifically approved. I thought of the heat that rolled through these hills every July. I thought of how fast flame moves through drought-dried brush. I tightened the padlock and started documenting everything. Emails, photographs, dated videos of me unlocking the gate and pointing out the city signage. My instincts had kept me alive in a dozen countries. They were flaring now, not in panic, but in cold, quiet preparation. Karen thought she was managing a neighborhood. She didn't realize she'd just picked a fight with a man who knew how to plan for battle. The next HOA newsletter arrived like a warning shot disguised as friendly fire. It was printed on glossy paper headlined with spring beautification and compliance initiative, and buried somewhere around paragraph 4 was a section that made my jaw tighten. All structures, gates, and visual elements visible from public trails or HOA easements must comply with updated aesthetic continuity guidelines. Special attention will be paid to rear fences, outbuildings, and non-uniform entry points. It wasn't subtle. It was a shot across the bow directed squarely at my rear exit gate. I didn't respond. Not yet. I kept doing what I'd been doing, documenting. I took fresh photos of the gate, the fire lane, the faded but legible city utility marker. I even emailed the city planning office again to request the original easement files just in case. 2 days later, I got a second violation. This one came with photos, grainy shots taken from behind my fence, zoomed in on the padlock and the hinge. It felt invasive, almost like someone had been lurking around back with a camera. The write-up cited deteriorating industrial hardware and non-HOA standard materials in view of pedestrian trail. The fine had jumped to $100. I filed a written appeal attaching the full municipal map and a scanned copy of the easement's original approval. I even included a short paragraph explaining that this gate, unsightly as it might seem to her, was in full compliance with local safety ordinances and, more importantly, had been there long before I bought the place. Karen's response came in less than 24 hours. It read, "Thank you for your concern. However, the HOA reserves the right to maintain uniform community appearance regardless of city grandfathering. Gate must be removed or aesthetically updated to comply. See attached paint color samples." She had actually sent me paint swatches. I laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. This wasn't about aesthetics. This was about power. I had something she couldn't control, and it grated on her. That weekend, I saw her walking the trail again. This time she wasn't alone. She had 2 other board members with her, one holding a clipboard, the other carrying what looked like a measuring tape. I stepped out onto my back deck, coffee in hand, and gave a little wave. Karen didn't wave back. She just pointed toward the gate, scribbled something, and moved on. I wasn't the only one she was after. Ruth stopped by that afternoon and told me Karen had issued 3 new violation notices in the past week. One for a mailbox that didn't match the trim color of the house, another for a swing set in someone's backyard, and a third for a decorative bird bath, too reflective apparently. But none of those were being fined $150 a day. That's what showed up next. The third violation letter came with an invoice, $150 per day. Retroactive to the date of the first notice, Karen had backdated the fine to the moment she'd first documented the gate. I called the HOA number again. This time it rang straight to voicemail. My blood pressure spiked, but I didn't lose it. I'm not built that way. Years of command taught me that anger is a tool, sharp, dangerous, and best used only when absolutely necessary. So instead, I sat down at my desk and began assembling a case file. Every photo, every email, every fine, every witness, comment. I titled it, Gate Incident, Phase 1. That Monday, I took a walk around the block and noticed something interesting. Karen's house, a 2-story beige stucco with polished brass fixtures, had a stone fountain in the front yard that spouted a stream of water from the mouth of a cherub. It was loud, ostentatious, and against Article 5, Section 2 of the very same HOA guidelines she cited against me. The next day, I printed out a formal inquiry and submitted it to the board, citing a potential violation. No response. But 2 days later, I received another fine. Same gate, same amount. This time with a bolded note, non-compliance will result in HOA vote for forced remediation. Forced remediation. In plain English, they were planning a vote to have someone come and remove my gate by force. The line had been crossed. I sent an official cease and desist to the HOA, citing local code and promising legal escalation. I copied the city's fire marshal and the Office of Emergency Services. I even visited the local firehouse and spoke to a lieutenant, showing him photos and documents. He frowned. "This is a registered egress," he said. "If they block this, they could be violating the safety code, especially during fire season." Exactly. But Karen didn't care. She wasn't looking for safety. She wanted obedience. What she didn't realize, not yet, was that I had no intention of letting a power-hungry neighbor strip me of the very thing that had kept me alive more than once a way out. She thought this was about a gate. She hadn't seen what I'm like when someone threatens my perimeter. I woke up that morning to the shrill beep of my phone. Another notification from the HOA app, and I already knew what it was before I swiped. Violation update, final warning. The words glared back at me in red. This time it wasn't just another fine. It was a formal announcement the HOA board had scheduled a vote to determine whether my non-compliant gate should be forcibly removed by contracted services. The notice gave a date, a time, and a location: Tuesdays at 7 p.m. in the HOA clubhouse, open to board members only. My coffee turned bitter in my mouth. They were going to hold a vote about removing a permitted emergency fire exit on private property with no public discussion, no due process, no review of my evidence, just Karen, her clipboard posse, and a stack of pre-typed ballots most likely. It was the kind of quiet tyranny that didn't look like tyranny at all. It looked like procedure. But I'd served in places where procedure was weaponized, where process replaced justice. I'd buried friends under flags because of it. I wasn't about to roll over now. I cleared my calendar and began preparing. The first thing I did was send certified letters to every HOA board member with copies of the easement, fire marshal recommendations, and a notarized affidavit from the previous owner stating that the gate was required under the property's original development agreement. I CC'd the city attorney's office and fire department again for good measure. Then I went door to door. It's not something I like doing. I'm not a politician. But I knew I couldn't rely on logic alone, not when Karen had been spinning her narrative through newsletters and beautification campaigns. I needed my neighbors to see what was really happening. Ruth was the first to answer. She looked at the stack of documents in my hand and shook her head. "They're railroading you," she said. "Karen's been telling people the gate is dangerous, that you're using it to sneak people in. Sneak people in." I showed her the fire lane approval stamp, the city's plat map, and the correspondence with the firehouse. She nodded grimly. "I'll come to the vote." By noon, I'd visited 12 houses. 8 neighbors said they'd been told by HOA bulletins that my gate compromised the community's integrity. 3 believed it. 5 were unsure. But 4, including Ruth, said they'd show up in support. That night, I prepared my statement. I didn't rant. I didn't threaten. I assembled a clean legal narrative, one rooted in municipal code and public safety precedent. I printed extra copies. I brought photos, video clips, and screenshots of every infraction Karen's own property had committed. But when I walked into the HOA clubhouse on Tuesday evening, I knew I was already at a disadvantage. Karen stood at the front of the room, smiling like a realtor on a billboard. The other board members, 2 men in golf polos, and a woman with a scarf patterned like HOA logos, barely looked up as I approached. The room was filled with folding chairs. Maybe 20 residents had shown up, most of them older, quiet, unsure of why they were even there. I raised my hand. Karen said sweetly, "I'm sorry, this is a board-only vote tonight. We won't be taking comments." I stood anyway. "I have documents proving this gate was approved by the city and required for emergency access. I've sent them to each of you. I've brought additional copies here. If you proceed with this vote, you could be held liable for obstructing emergency egress under municipal fire code." Karen smiled wider. "Noted." She turned to the board. "Shall we proceed to vote?" The man on the left. "Doug." I think his name was shifted in his chair. "Shouldn't we at least look at the papers? They've been reviewed," Karen said quickly. "There's no official variance on file. The gate is not part of the original HOA design. We're here to protect community standards." Doug looked unsure. The woman with the scarf whispered something to him, and he nodded. Karen continued. "All in favor of forced removal of the non-compliant structure at Lot 14." Hands went up. 4 out of 5. Just like that, it passed. The room went quiet. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't storm out. I picked up my stack of papers and walked straight to the exit. But not before turning to face Karen one last time. "This is a mistake," I said calmly. not just legally, morally. One day, someone's going to need that gate, and you're going to wish you'd listened. She didn't answer. Outside, Ruth caught up with me. That was wrong, she said. We all saw it. I nodded. Then we need to be louder. By the end of the week, a crew had arrived, unmarked white van, work gloves, power tools. I stood on my porch and watched as they began dismantling the rear gate. I didn't stop them. I just filmed the whole thing. That night, I uploaded the footage to a private Dropbox, labeled it Exhibit A. The next phase had begun. Karen thought it was over. She had no idea I'd just pulled my first pin. I had only been gone for 3 days, just a short trip to Denver to visit my sister, help her settle some things after surgery, and get a break from the boiling pressure that Karen and her HOA disciples had been building like a slow-cooked storm. I remember driving out of the neighborhood that Friday, glancing once at the fire gate, still intact, and thinking, at least they haven't touched it yet. I was wrong. When I returned Sunday night, the first thing I noticed was the faint glint of metal under the glow of my motion light. A fence, not just any fence. This was a freshly welded 6-foot-tall iron structure with vertical bars, a security crosslock, and 2 concrete-set pillars anchoring it directly into the earth. It sliced across my entire back property line, obliterating my fire gate and sealing off the escape route entirely. I pulled my truck to a slow stop. The keys hung frozen in the ignition. I stepped out, boots crunching on gravel, and walked toward it, heart pounding. A laminated notice flapped in the wind, zip-tied to the metal bars. HOA letterhead. Same bold font they always used. Same smug signature, Karen Ellsworth, HOA President. As approved in HOA Vote number 2024-117, a compliance contractor has sealed the unauthorized gate in accordance with Covenant Code 14A. This is a permanent fixture. Any attempt to remove or alter this barrier will result in legal action and daily fines. I didn't remember the air being this still. It was the kind of silence I'd heard before in combat zones the moment before something explodes, because this wasn't just a fence, this was a declaration. I walked the perimeter with a flashlight. They'd driven steel rebar down through the drainage ditch. My entire rear property line, which, by the way, had an approved easement from the city, and a right-of-way agreement, was now boxed in like a cage. The emergency lane that ran behind the neighborhood, built precisely for fire risk mitigation, was now blocked by welded metal. That night, I barely slept. At 4:12 a.m., I began drafting emails. First to the fire marshal, then to the county zoning office. I attached the video footage I'd taken of the crew the week prior, noted the lack of permits, and included screenshots of the HOA minutes showing that no city variance had been granted for obstructing emergency access. By noon, I had responses. The fire department confirmed they'd not been notified of any structural changes along the fire lane. The city zoning officer said there was no application on record for barrier installation. One brave soul in the code enforcement office even flagged the issue for public safety review. But that didn't stop the daily fines. They started arriving on my doorstep 2 days later, $150 a day, same as before. Only now they came with legal citations stapled to them. Non-compliance with community board decision. Karen even had the audacity to include photos from my own backyard, taken from behind shrubbery showing the gate prior to removal. She had built her case in the shadows. I filed an emergency injunction with the municipal court. That bought me 72 hours of legal breathing room. But the HOA responded by filing a counter-nuisance claim, accusing me of provoking hostility, spreading disinformation, and absurdly creating visual disorder within the community. The absurdity would have been funny if it weren't so dangerous, because behind all the bureaucracy and HOA doublespeak, I couldn't shake one sickening truth. If a fire started now, no one on our side of the block had an escape route. The front roads curved downhill and had already proven bottleneck-prone. If a blaze swept through from the canyons, that back gate was our only real option. But now it was gone. Sealed. Buried under HOA arrogance and a few $1,000s in steel. I began taking photos every morning. Wide shots, close-ups, timestamps. I recorded conversations with neighbors who expressed concern. Ruth signed a written statement. 2 more families agreed to join a group petition I was forming. I sent copies to a lawyer friend who owed me a favor from our service days. Still, the HOA persisted. Karen doubled down with smug newsletters. We thank the community for supporting improvements that beautify and standardize our beloved neighborhood. We understand change can be difficult for some, but together we ensure a cohesive, compliant, and secure environment. Cohesive, compliant, secure. I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. Because I knew something Karen didn't. Nature doesn't care about fences. And summer was coming. Our valley hadn't seen serious rain in 4 months. The hills were dry, winds were strong. Fire warnings came weekly now. And one of these nights, just like I'd seen overseas, a single spark would undo all their power plays, all their paperwork, all their polished newsletters. And when that day came, they'd remember the man they ignored. And the gate they destroyed. I spent the next few days making phone calls like it was my second job. I didn't want to go to war with the HOA, I really didn't. But every time I looked at that barricaded escape route, I felt something gnawing at me. Not just the personal insult of it, not just the violation of common sense, but a deeper, more primal fear. The kind you learn when you've seen people trapped, when you've seen smoke crawl across ceilings like fingers, and you know that seconds, just seconds, can mean the difference between breathing and never breathing again. So I put everything into motion. First, I emailed a formal appeal to the HOA board, not that I expected much. I attached annotated photos, city zoning maps, and a scanned copy of the original fire escape variants that had come with the property title. I outlined how the fence violated municipal code and endangered lives. I didn't get a response. Next, I called the local fire department again. Not the main line this time. I called someone I knew, Captain Morales. We'd served together overseas for a brief stint. He'd once pulled me out of a burning Jeep in Kandahar, so I figured he'd take my call. He did. After I explained the situation, he was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "Send me everything, every picture, every measurement. I'll have one of our inspectors out by Friday." That gave me hope. By the end of the week, Fire Inspector Daniels came by with a clipboard and a calm demeanor. I watched from my porch as he measured the fence, took photos, and nodded to himself. We chatted briefly. He asked about wind patterns, the access road, and the structure of nearby properties. "This fire road's part of your community emergency plan," he said. "It's in the original HOA filing with the city. Blocking it violates the fire access easement." I felt a flicker of relief, finally proof. But as expected, the HOA pushed back, hard. Karen scheduled a special session board meeting on Monday night. It was technically public, but they only gave 24 hours notice and held it in the back room of the clubhouse instead of the usual rec hall. I showed up anyway. So did Ruth and 3 other neighbors who had signed my petition. The moment I walked in, I knew it was a setup. Karen sat at the head of the long oak table, flanked by her usual lieutenants, Jeff, with the sunglasses indoors, and Mary with her endless scribbling on legal pads. A whiteboard stood behind them, already pre-filled with phrases like community aesthetic, standards, resident non-cooperation, gate violations, visual nuisance. I waited for my chance to speak, but they barely let me finish 2 sentences before cutting me off. "Mr. Lancer, we appreciate your passion," Karen said, smiling like a substitute teacher who secretly hates children. "But we voted unanimously. The gate is not consistent with the community's appearance goals." "This isn't about appearance," I said, holding up a copy of the fire code. "It's about escape routes. It's about survival." Karen's smile tightened. "We consulted our legal counsel. The fence installation is within our jurisdiction, and your continued agitation is bordering on harassment." I looked at the other board members, but their eyes were on the table. So I made one final move. I stood up, held out the folder with the fire inspector's preliminary report, and placed it gently in front of Karen. "Just remember," I said, "when something goes wrong, and it will, these documents will be Exhibit A. You won't be able to say you didn't know." I left before she could respond. The next day, I filed a formal complaint with the city. Then I filed one with the County Fire Safety Board. I even submitted a copy of the situation to our local newspaper's Civic Watch column, just in case some editor was feeling brave. But the machine turned slowly. Days became weeks. The fines kept coming $150 a day. HOA officers started walking by my house with clipboards more frequently. One even took pictures of my mailbox. I couldn't tell if they were trying to catch me on some other violation or just trying to rattle me. But I stayed focused. I added more signatures to the petition, built a spreadsheet of other residents who had unresolved complaints with the board like unexplained fines, biased enforcement, and unapproved expenditures. I discovered that the HOA had spent nearly $15,000 on community aesthetic consulting in the past year, but hadn't fixed a single pothole. The numbers told a story. And then just when I thought the tide might be turning, something terrible happened. It started with a flicker, a power outage in the northwest side of the neighborhood, a downed line from the wind. Nothing out until a small spark caught the dry brush behind the houses on Red Ridge Drive. And just like that, everything I'd warned about became real. The fire started downwind. The temperature had hovered around 104 degrees that week. Grass was dry, wind was steady, and by the time the first emergency call went out, flames had already reached the edge of the HOA's central walking path. I stood on my porch and saw the smoke. Thick, black, unnatural. Then came the panic. Screaming, barking dogs, sirens somewhere in the distance. And behind my house, the fence. The same metal barrier that had stood smug and silent for weeks, now blocking the one path that could save the people behind it, including Karen. The moment I saw that dark plume of smoke rising over the ridge, I felt a cold drop in my stomach that had nothing to do with fear. It was instinct. That old trained instinct from years ago. Fires don't ask for permission. They don't knock politely. They consume. I threw on my boots and grabbed my fire emergency kit from the hall closet. My hands moved quickly, almost mechanically. I had packed it months ago when I first moved in, just in case. Water jugs, gloves, masks, a pry bar, and a handheld radio set to the county emergency frequency. By the time I stepped outside, the sky had gone from sunny yellow to a smoky gray. The air carried that dry, bitter scent, burning sagebrush and plastic. I could already hear the distant pop, pop, pop of exploding propane tanks, maybe from grills or gas lines further down the block. Dogs barked frantically in the distance, and someone's car alarm wailed like a lost child. I raced to the back of my property and looked past the fence. What had once been an open fire road was now a corridor of disaster. The brush on the other side had ignited. Small flames danced between patches of dry grass and juniper. Sparks carried by the wind had already leapt into the first backyard of the homes facing the cul-de-sac. If it wasn't stopped, it would reach the densely packed houses in a matter of minutes. And worse, those houses had only one official exit, the front road. But I had just heard on the emergency channel that the power pole at the entrance of our subdivision had snapped and fallen. It blocked the only drivable way out. The dispatcher's voice on the radio had been strained. "We're dispatching crews, but traffic control at the entrance is jammed. Advise residents to shelter in place if safe." That wasn't going to cut it, especially not for the house at the end of the cul-de-sac, Karen's house. Her voice just moments later burst through the chaos. "Help someone, help!" It came from behind the fence, muffled but frantic. I sprinted to the metal barrier that the HOA had so proudly installed, the same one they claimed upheld community aesthetics. It was radiating heat from the nearby flames, and on the other side, I saw her Karen banging both fists against it. Her face streaked with soot and sweat, her eyes wide and wild. Her husband, a tall man with a limp, stumbled behind her, coughing hard. Behind them, the hedge that lined their back patio was already smoldering. She screamed again when she saw me. "Open the gate, please! The fire's coming!" There was no gate. The entire length of the fence had been welded, bolted, and reinforced with tamper-proof screws. Because appearances mattered more than function. Because rules mattered more than life. "I can't open it," I yelled back. "You blocked it, remember?" Oh. She froze her mouth open, her eyes full of the sudden realization that she had sealed herself inside a cage of her own making. "We'll die," she shouted. I didn't answer. Instead, I ran to my shed, grabbed the bolt cutter, snapped them in half against the steel, too thick. Then the sledgehammer barely a dent. I grabbed my fire axe, the one I kept from my army days, and sprinted back. Each breath burned. Ash now drifted down like black snow. The flames were climbing higher, swallowing a pine tree 50 feet away. I raised the axe and brought it down on the metal frame. Clang again, clang, move back! I shouted to Karen and her husband. She obeyed, her fear finally eclipsing her pride. Clang. The welds began to crack. The fourth swing bent the frame just enough for me to wedge the axe handle in and pry. I grunted, strained until something snapped, and a section of the fence peeled open like a can lid. Go! Karen didn't hesitate. She grabbed her husband's arm, and together they stumbled through the opening. She looked back once, just once, with a face full of something I couldn't read. Not gratitude, not remorse, just raw, stunned disbelief. As if she couldn't fathom how things had escalated to this moment, that the fire was real, that the escape was blocked, and that the man she'd tried to silence was the one saving her life. They weren't the only ones. Behind them, a mother holding a baby emerged, eyes wide. Then two teenage boys on bikes. One of them yelled, "Mr. Lancer, the Connors are trapped inside. I didn't have time to think." I yelled into my radio, relaying coordinates, then dashed down the improvised path into the smoke. What followed was a blur dragging garden hoses across roofs, helping a dog jump a fence, pouring water over burning shingles. But through it all, I kept hearing the metallic screech of the fence giving way behind me. One after another, neighbors pushed through the breach I had made. That fence had almost killed us all. And now it was nothing more than twisted scrap. When the fire department finally arrived, red trucks screaming, lights flashing, I waved them down from the ridge. A captain I didn't know shouted, "Is that the easement access?" Why the hell was it blocked? I just pointed at the twisted iron and said, "Ask the HOA." Later that night, when the flames were under control and the fire lines held, I sat on my back porch, shirt-soaked arms trembling. The back gate stood wide open, and the community finally understood what it meant to be trapped. By dawn, the ridge was charred black and smoking. The fire was mostly contained thanks to the brave work of the county fire department and the break in the wind. But the scars it left weren't just on the land. They were seared into everyone's memory. Most of my neighbors were shaken, but safe, huddled around emergency tents the Red Cross had set up at the community center. We exchanged tired nods, shell-shocked glances, and silent gratitude. The kind you don't say aloud because the words can't capture what it feels like to nearly die together. But Karen wasn't there. No. She sat on her front porch wrapped in a foil blanket flanked by two paramedics. Her husband had a bandage on his forehead and a cough that wouldn't quit. Their backyard was scorched. The pool had boiled dry and the patio roof had collapsed from the heat. They had lost a lot. Not everything, but enough to feel it in their bones. I hadn't planned to talk to her, not then. But as I walked past her house on the way back from helping clear debris near the main road, she looked up. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time since I'd moved in, she didn't look like the queen of the HOA. She looked like a woman who had watched her world catch fire. "You could have let us burn," she said quietly. I stopped in my tracks. "You blocked the only way out," I replied. "It wasn't about what I could do. It was about what you wouldn't let me do." Her eyes welled up, but she blinked the tears away and stiffened her jaw like a soldier. "I was just following protocol," she said, "maintaining uniformity." That's what the board. I raised my hand to stop her. "Karen, you welded a fire exit shut. That wasn't protocol. That was ego." She didn't say anything after that. But her silence said enough. That afternoon, the fire marshal called a meeting. We gathered in the park, what was left of it beneath the half-charred canopy of trees. Folding chairs were lined in haphazard rows, many occupied by residents still wearing masks, or wrapped in Red Cross blankets. The marshal stood in front of a large foam board showing the map of our neighborhood. Red marks showed the fire's path. A bright yellow X was drawn across the area, where the back access road had been blocked. This obstruction, he said, tapping the X, violated County Fire Code 42.3. It directly hindered the evacuation process and put lives at risk. Murmurs rose from the crowd. Karen stood in the back row, arms crossed, sunglasses hiding her face. This wasn't the fire's fault, he continued. This was a man-made mistake. Someone prioritized aesthetics over access. That someone may have to answer for it. Someone in the crowd whispered, "It was the HOA." Another added, "Karen pushed that fence through. The marshal didn't name names. He didn't have to." Then, in a moment, I'll never forget, the marshal turned toward me. "But I also want to acknowledge Mr. Lancer," he said, his voice firm, "who, despite being fined, harassed, and ignored, took it upon himself to break through the obstruction and assist multiple households in evacuating. His actions saved lives." The crowd applauded. Not politely, not awkwardly. It was loud, raw, earnest. I nodded once and sat back down quietly. Behind me, I could feel Karen's eyes burning into my back. Not with hatred, not with contempt. With the painful realization that she had been so wrong and the person she tried to silence had been the one who protected everyone, including her. Later that week, the HOA held an emergency board meeting, and for once, it wasn't behind closed doors. The community demanded answers. Karen stepped up to the podium, no windbreaker, no smugness. Just a pale, trembling version of the woman who used to rule every inch of this neighborhood. "I take full responsibility for the fence installation," she said. "It was a mistake. I thought I was protecting our community. But I see now. I put people in danger. I'm resigning effective immediately." No one clapped. No one cheered. It wasn't a victory. It was a reckoning. The morning after the emergency HOA meeting, the air still smelled like smoke and melted plastic. Ash clung to tree trunks, driveways, and flower beds, like ghostly fingerprints of what had almost been. The blackened fence that had blocked the fire escape stood jagged and twisted, a monument to misplaced power and nearly fatal pride. I stood there staring at it, the dull axe I had used to break it still leaning against the nearby tree. My palms were blistered. My arms ached. But the image of Karen screaming behind the gate that night, her husband coughing, the fire licking the sky behind them, was branded into my mind more than the pain in my muscles. I hadn't broken that fence to prove a point. I'd broken it because it was the only thing standing between life and death. And the irony was sharp. The same HOA rules meant to preserve safety nearly killed everyone they were supposed to protect. After the public apology and her resignation, Karen vanished. Word around the neighborhood was she and her husband had taken a leave of absence, gone to stay with family out of town. I didn't ask. I didn't need to know. But the damage left in her wake was still very much present, and not just in scorched siding or melted mailboxes. The trust was gone. Neighbors who once waved from porches now gathered in small clusters, voices, lowered questions, swirling. How did we let it get this far? Who else approved the fence? Why didn't anyone speak up? And always, what if Lancer hadn't been there? I didn't want to be a hero. I just wanted to be left alone with my workshop and the quiet of my ranch road. But fate had a way of dragging you into the center when you least wanted it. That afternoon, a woman named Priya from the block over knocked on my door. Her voice was soft, but her eyes were firm. "A few of us are forming a petition," she said, "to call for a re-evaluation of all HOA emergency access policies. We need your help." I invited her in. We sat at the kitchen table. I laid out maps, zoning paperwork, and photos I'd saved from before and after the fire. My military background made me thorough. Karen had mocked that, once said I took the HOA too seriously. Well, someone had to. That weekend, we hosted an open-air town meeting, not an HOA board meeting, not behind glass and gavel, but a real gathering where anyone could speak. Families came, seniors, teenagers, veterans, renters, owners. People who never came to HOA meetings before showed up with their stories. A young couple recounted how their garden hose saved their neighbor's dog before the fire trucks arrived. An older woman described tripping over the new fence during her escape attempt. Another man broke down in tears, confessing he hadn't voted during the aesthetic gate removal ballot because he didn't think it mattered. But it did. It all mattered. One by one, people realized how much power they had handed over in the name of compliance and how much damage it had done. The county council called me 2 weeks later. They had seen the news reports, read the fire marshal's report. They invited me to speak at a safety reform panel. When I arrived, I didn't bring anger. I brought evidence, photos, code violations, HOA meeting transcripts, and the voice of our neighborhood, raw and real. I spoke not as a veteran, not even as a victim, but as someone who believed in neighborhoods, protecting one another, not policing each other. By the end of the session, 3 county representatives had agreed to review their municipal code regarding private associations and fire safety compliance. It was a start. Back home, the scars of the fire slowly began to heal. Neighbors helped repaint fences, replace roofing, replant what had been lost. The HOA board was restructured. Emergency preparedness training became a requirement, not an option. And the backfire gate, it was reopened. Not just for me, for everyone. A motion was passed to name it officially on the neighborhood map, the Lancer Gate. They even put up a modest sign. I didn't cry when I saw it, but I did touch it. The cool metal reminded me not of pride, but of duty. Not the kind you wear in uniform, but the kind you carry when you see something wrong, and do something anyway. 3 weeks after the fire, our neighborhood finally exhaled. The blackened tree trunks still whispered of how close we came to losing it all, but now the air buzzed with something else entirely reckoning. The county's formal investigation wrapped faster than anyone expected. Fire marshal reports, HOA meeting minutes, eyewitness testimonies all pointing in one direction, gross negligence on the part of the HOA board, and particularly its then president, Karen Whitlock. I was summoned to testify in a special hearing, not in court, but in front of the county's Neighborhood Safety Advisory Council, a panel of 5 officials who looked more like tired high school principals than public prosecutors. But their questions cut sharper than any lawyers. When did you first request the back gate remain open? How many formal warnings did the HOA issue? Was the fire escape in violation of any local safety codes? I had receipts. Dozens of them. Emails, photos, video footage from my doorbell cam of the contractors welding that steel gate shut while I was out of town. And perhaps most damning, a copy of a text message from one board member to another that read, "He'll thank us later." That eyesore is finally gone. They didn't realize they'd sealed more than a gate. They'd sealed their fate. That week, local media caught wind of the story. A headline ran in bold across the homepage of the regional paper Veteran Saves HOA. From Blaze, now HOA faces backlash over sealed emergency gate. Suddenly people cared, not just in our neighborhood, but across the state. Other residents from distant HOAs began writing in the comments, "This happened to my father." They bricked over his storm shelter exit. We tried to fight our HOA's gate ordinance, too. They called it beautification. We need this man on a safety board somewhere. I didn't ask for a movement, but one was forming, and at the center of it, whether I liked it or not, was me. Then came the letter, delivered not by post, but by hand. A timid knock at my door one Thursday morning, and there she was, Karen. No sunglasses, no clipboard, no smug tilt of her head. Just a plain white envelope and eyes swollen from days of crying. "I came to give you this," she said quietly, holding it out, and to say I was wrong. Inside her formal resignation letter already submitted to the HOA, along with a personal note. She admitted to prioritizing aesthetics over safety, to misusing her influence, to disregarding the very real consequences of her decisions. She didn't offer excuses, and she didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply said, "You saved our lives. And I made it harder for you to do that. I'm sorry." It was the first time I had ever seen her without the armor of authority. And it was the only time I saw her cry. I didn't say much, only this: "It's not about you. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." She nodded and walked away. She hasn't returned since. The HOA board held a special session the next week. With Karen gone, a new interim president was elected, Priya, the same neighbor who had knocked on my door with a petition. The board voted unanimously to revise the architectural code's safety bylaws and emergency response provisions. Then came the restitution vote. They reimbursed me for all fines levied over the unauthorized gate, nearly $9,300. They offered to pay for the repairs to the back gate. And in a rare act of grace, They organized a neighborhood recognition ceremony in the community park. I didn't want a ceremony, but I showed up anyway. A few folding chairs, a podium, some cheap lemonade, and neighbors who once looked the other way, now looking straight at me with something new in their eyes. Respect. The fire department presented me with a civilian service recognition plaque. A local reporter snapped a photo. And in the back, standing awkwardly near the picnic tables, was a girl maybe 13 with long dark hair and a quiet smile. Karen's daughter. When it was over, she approached me, said nothing at first, then handed me a drawing. Crayon's paper slightly smudged. It showed a man breaking a fence with an axe. A little girl behind the gate. A house with flames in the distance. And beneath it, in childish handwriting, "Thank you for opening the way." I don't remember if I said thank you, but I never threw the picture away. It still sits in a frame above my workbench next to my military medals, a reminder that the loudest gratitude doesn't come in applause or headlines. It comes in moments like that. I never set out to become an activist. I was a retired military logistics officer who wanted some peace, a small garden, and maybe a place where I could teach my nephew how to fix a carburetor. But life rarely asks for permission when handing out purpose. After the fire, everything changed, not just for me, but for our neighborhood. The HOA meetings, once sparsely attended and dominated by those with the loudest voices or the deepest pockets, were suddenly standing room only. People who had never spoken up before, the elderly man, 2 doors down, the single mom on the corner, even teenagers started showing up, taking notes, raising hands. The culture of silence cracked open like an old fence. It started small. A motion to install emergency access signs throughout the neighborhood. Then a proposal for a third-party safety audit. Eventually, a push to rewrite the HOA charter itself to prioritize safety transparency, and most importantly, resident consent over aesthetic mandates. And it wasn't just our neighborhood. The story of the veteran who saved the HOA that fined him made its way onto a local radio show, then a statewide public safety podcast. People from other states emailed me, some even driving hours, just to shake my hand and ask for advice on how to stand up without burning everything down. That's when I founded Backgate Watch. Not a political group, not a protest mob, just a collective of residents from around the county who'd experienced HOA overreach, people who wanted tools, knowledge, and community. We created an online forum, shared legal resources, helped folks connect with local fire marshals, urban planners, and housing rights advocates. We weren't trying to overthrow HOA systems. We just wanted them to remember who the word homeowner was really about. And something amazing happened. The fear began to fade. The resigned shrugs that once greeted HOA bullying turned into confident "not on my watch" declarations. Residents began documenting violations, organizing safety drills, even volunteering to support elderly neighbors with compliance paperwork. I saw teenagers printing petitions, single dads calling city council members, and one woman, a former HOA board member, tearfully confessed during a meeting, "I didn't know how much harm we were doing until someone showed me." That someone wasn't just me. It was all of us, together. And yet, for all the public change, it's the quiet things that stay with me. Like the new wooden gate behind my house this time, reinforced with fire-resistant metal, approved unanimously by the new HOA board. It even bears a plaque now in honor of those who open the way, not just for themselves, but for others. Or the knock on my door one late Sunday afternoon. I opened it to find Karen's daughter again this time, with a box of cookies. No card, no grand gesture, just an awkward smile and a simple sentence, "My mom's in counseling. She said I should tell you. Thanks again." I didn't pry. I didn't ask for details. Some redemptions don't need to be explained. Some wounds don't scar, they reshape. That night, I sat by the back gate looking out at the path beyond it, now cleared and lit with new solar safety lamps. It reminded me of my time overseas, how the smallest safe passage, even a hidden alley or a rear door, could mean the difference between survival and loss. And now here in suburban America, that same truth echoed. Freedom isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a gate that opens when it matters most. In the end, it wasn't the fire that changed us. It was what we chose to do afterward. How we rebuilt not just fences, but faith in each other. And for the first time, in a long time, I felt like I belonged. Not because the HOA allowed it, but because the neighborhood remembered what it meant to be neighbors.